Okay, good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to this Global Networking Forum. And this is going to be focusing on the outcomes of the GLEC 2019 conference. So GLEC is the Global Conference on Space for Emerging Countries. And this was held in Morocco, Marrakech, in April this year. So by way of introduction, my name is Val Munsami. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the South African National Space Agency, and also the Vice President of the Developing Countries and Emerging Nations. I do have a panelist who up here who were also moderators for at least two of the sessions. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, Kirsten and Crystal.
I'm Kirsten Armstrong. I'm with Petra Strategy, and I moderated a panel on the financial side.
Great, and my name is Crystal Wilson. I'm with Secure World Foundation. I'm a Director of Space Applications Programs, and I moderated the panel on base infrastructure requirements.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to do is just present to you the sort of the essence of the context for the GLEC conference itself, and then touch on some of the recommendations that came out of the various plenary sessions. And at the very end, I'll share with you a video in terms of the GLEC experience itself. So just to start off, when we conceptualized the conference on space for emerging countries, we started off by looking at, so what are the key issues that are plaguing emerging countries that we needed to take stock of? And we came up with a set of issues, which is essentially the first being the socio-economic benefits of space applications. And we have a huge problem in emerging countries where political principles do not understand the value proposition of space science and technology. So we have a huge challenge in terms of educating and making our political principles aware of the benefits of space, our socio-economic benefits of space applications. The second is, once you've won over your political principles, is how do you get the financial resourcing in place? And so we needed to understand, so what is the various financial models that emerging countries could adopt in terms of financing space programs? And the third issue was around technology and skills transfer. So obviously, if you're in the starting blocks with regards to setting up a space program, your expertise or your skills base is very critical, because that determines your trajectory for the future. So the technology and skills transfer was a key component of that. And then the fourth issue was around the basic infrastructure you would require to set up a space program, especially in an emerging country context. And then the fifth one was around the essential legislative and policy elements that one needs to put in place. So if you're an emerging nation and you're setting up to set up a formal space program, what are the legislative or the policy issues that you need to look at in order to set up the space program effectively? And I'll come to those issues as we go along. So just trying to take stock of what the key issues are with regards to emerging countries, we then came up with a set of plenary sessions, and essentially we had 6 plenaries for the conference itself. The first one was looking at the benefits of space technology and applications to socio-economic development. And it was very important for, especially this part, is to get 2 different perspectives. One from the space agency perspective, who are normally in control of the sort of policy, strategy environment. And then the second was to get the industry perspective in terms of where your products and services or your technologies actually get developed. So it was important for us to get those dual perspectives. And then the second plenary session was on the financial models and the resourcing. The third one is how do we address the technology and skills gap in the emerging nations. And as the fourth and the fifth one is around the industry and the infrastructure requirements. And then the last one was the legal and policy plenary. So just to give you a sense, the 3-day conference in a glance, we started off with the opening ceremony, which is in the green, and it ended up in results and recommendations. So it was a plenary session at the end. But the yellows are essentially your plenary sessions. So on the first day, we had plenary 1, 2 parts, the space agency and the industry perspective, and then the financial models at the end of day 1. And then we had plenary 3 and 4, which is on the technology and skills development, and then also on the base infrastructure requirements. You'll notice that there was an SGAC, the Space Generation Advisory Council, on the second day of the conference. And that was by design, because normally the SGAC is a pre-conference event to the global conferences. So we wanted to ensure that the youth, or the Space Generation Advisory Council workshop, was an integral part of the conference itself and not seen as a separate side event. And then on the third day, we had the plenary 5 and plenary 6. And as I said, we convened a plenary session where we came back and reported on the results from each of the plenaries. Just in terms of participation, we had almost 400 participants from 20 countries. And we conducted, or the IAF Secretariat conducted a survey at the end of it. And essentially it came out the satisfaction rating of 4.42 over 5, which is fairly successful for the first conference of its kind. What I should mention is that over 50% of the participants came from Africa and 32% came from Europe. That in itself indicating there's a huge interest, especially from Europe, to work with emerging countries. Okay. And then just in terms of institutional types, the largest representation came from universities, which was 24%, and then followed by industry, 23%, and other being normally government institutions and public sector institutions that are not necessarily directly linked to space. Okay, so those are normally your user institutions. And interestingly enough, 16% were from space agencies. And then there were also a number of exhibitors, 8 in total, that exhibited in terms of opportunities. And then your sponsors the gold sponsors was UAE Space Agency and DFH Satellite Company. And the silver sponsors was Airbus and Azure Cosmos. So I'd like to acknowledge their contribution to making this a success. So I just want to very briefly touch a slide on each of the plenary sessions. So plenary 1, as I said, was 2 parts. The first part was the agency perspective. So just from the agency perspective, the set of recommendations that came out was that there was a need for the agencies to engage with and align to government priorities. Now that's very core, because agencies are normally set up by governments themselves. And it was important that as you set up the agency, you take cognizance of what is the priorities of government. And then as the agency is set up and running and established, it was also very important that you live or you align to those priorities. And so you had to ensure that you develop the full range of products and services that links back to the priorities that was essentially the seed for setting up the space program. We also have to be very careful, because very often, especially from emerging nations, the focus is on space applications. But if you get caught up in terms of national prestige, that can take you away from the space applications aspect in terms of the benefits. So you have to balance between national prestige and not diluting the national investments in terms of space applications and benefits. And then when we started to engage with regards to international collaboration, especially at an agency perspective, we had to ensure that there was a win-win approach. Because very often in terms of emerging nations, you get the donor-recipient type of relationship. And we needed to ensure that we don't fall into the trap, because the agendas is not necessarily set up at the recipient end, it's set up at the donor's end. So you need to ensure there's a win-win approach, and that will ensure that we maximize the benefits of cooperation to both parties. And from an emerging countries perspective, specifically, it will also ensure that you increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the national policy that gave rise to the National Space Program. Okay. And I think most importantly, an agency function is to ensure that they inspire the youth for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and have a program that's set up to create the skills that's required for the space program. And then we looked at the industry perspective. So our keynote speaker there was Charles Bolden. And I'm raising this because the first bullet point essentially talks to why we have the public-private partnerships we're seeing today in the US. And that was essentially kick-started by the space shuttle disasters that we had. I think it's the Columbia. When that incident occurred, NASA sort of rethought its approach with regards to the space shuttle missions. And so they decided, let's engage with the industry and bring them on board as partners so that we don't fall into the trap of trying to do this on our own. And essentially the industry was brought in for three different reasons. One is to provide services for the international space stations. The second was to transport the astronauts to the International Space Station. And the third was to bring or promote international collaboration. So in fact, if you walk around today at the exhibition hall, you'll see a number of entities actually trying to engage other countries with regards to international collaboration, especially on the International Space Station. And then from an industry perspective, it was indicated that there was a need to focus on downstream applications. A prime example that came through was the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, if you look at it from, in terms of the value chain, the maximum or the optimum value proposition is on the downstream. The upstream, in terms of the technology platforms, those are actually the means to the actual end, not the end itself. So building a satellite, for example, is not an end in itself. It's a means to achieving or developing the applications and the end of the value chain. And so the focus should be on ultimately addressing the user applications and the user needs. There was also a need for a recognition that in emerging countries, there's a reduced barrier to entry of new technologies. Now, by that I mean, if you take your major space agencies in this world and around the globe, there is a sense of heritage, okay? Heritage in the sense that there's a certain technology path that has been chosen, that they are following. And to change tech is very difficult in terms of adopting new technology. Whereas in emerging nations, because you're on the starting block, it's much easier for you to adopt new technologies. So developed nations could use emerging nations as test beds for new technology platforms. So that was an interesting perspective in terms of how industry could engage industry from developed to developing nations or emerging nations. And then the government itself had to play a role, and this was from the industry side, that the government had to create an enabling local system to support the industry itself. And ultimately, it was left to the industry to maximize the return on investments as a case for further investments. So once you have secured an investment from government or the public coffers, you had to ensure that you demonstrate the return on investment so you can secure future funding as well. Then the second plenary was around the financial models, and what is important from the financial models discussion is that irrespective of whether you think you have a space program or not, you're actually using space products and services. Whether it's telecoms or looking at the weather report, it's space applications. Okay, so there's understanding that there's daily consumption of space products and services, which is sunk cost in any case. So how do you leverage on the fact that you're already using space products and services and enhance the value of that product offering? We also needed to demonstrate the value to the economy and the quality of life. So any government that is worth its salt has two key priorities. One is to stimulate economic growth, and the second one is to improve the quality of life of its citizens. Okay, and once you can demonstrate that, then the financial model of funding issues or constraints sort of kick in automatically in terms of securing that investment. And it was also very important that before you jump into setting up a space program and figuring out what you need to do, you need to go back to the drawing board and understand why you're setting up the space program. So the why is very important before you even engage on the how. And space is also should be part of the economic growth plan because it's part of modern day life. If you have to switch off all the satellites today, you'll feel the impact. So it's part of the economy and the social domain. From the investors that were part of the the panel, we took recognition of the fact that there's a blended mix of models for financing your space program. You have venture capitalists, you have public sector institutions who are willing to fund, and obviously your government funding, and the private sector also coming through. There was also a recommendation to maybe consider small satellites as a platform for socio-economic applications, and I think CubeSats is a prime example as to where developing or emerging nations can quickly enter into the space domain in a very cost-effective manner. And then the third plenary was on technology and skills development, and here the recognition was taken of the role of academia in educating and training, and also research for that matter. And so there was also, given the earlier point I made, that emerging nations should focus on space applications rather than starting off with the technology end. There's also a need to educate the youth around the space applications end of it. And then universities should also look at participating in international projects. And I think we're seeing examples of that already starting to crop up in various domains. And that government should have a national plan to address the skills needs for a space program. Okay. There's also recognition that companies or private sector industries could play a huge role in terms of skills, building the expertise, especially in terms of internship programs and so on. And then developed countries could also support emerging nations through know-how exchange and training. So it didn't make sense for emerging nations to now go reinvent the wheel, to invest in trying to figure out how to develop certain technology platforms, certain applications, when that skills base already exists elsewhere. So there's a need to transfer that skills and know-how from the developed nations to the emerging nations. And then there's a partnership with industry to encourage investments. So effectively, industry themselves should invest in the space program itself. And then the base infrastructure of national space programs. So the national space programs should, the fundamental core of that should be the base infrastructure as the driver for the national space program. But once you put the infrastructure in place, that's not the end all of it. You need to ensure that you have the skills base to operate the infrastructure. So developing that skills is also very important. And you could actually leverage on the international cooperation to support those activities, putting that infrastructure in place and building the skills to operate that. And there's also a focus, given the first 2 or 3 points I've made on this slide, is on the focus on applications with skills development as a key factor. So you use the infrastructure, but focusing on the applications that come at the end of it. And you need to build the domestic support first before looking internationally. So if you're going to go into an international collaboration, it's no use engaging in international partnerships if you don't have the skills base back home or the resources to do that. So you need to ensure that that environment back home is ready for international collaboration. So there's a pre-scoping work that needs to be done. And infrastructure should be considered as critical rather than optional. And I think we've seen this in emerging countries quite often. You know, government puts funding into an infrastructure, you have an infrastructure build, but there's no funding to operate or maintain the facility. And very quickly that infrastructure goes south. So you need to look at an infrastructure as a critical component rather than just something that's optional, that you can fund it, set it up, and then walk away from it. And then there's applications for information and decision making, so the infrastructure should support, back to the very first point I made, government priorities in terms of decision making and providing the necessary information. And then the fifth aspect was the industry development. I think venture capital plays a key role, especially in the developed nations, but we need to see how we embed that as part of the emerging nations as well. And then capacity building and contribution to the economy are key drivers for industry development, okay? Because industry plays a key role, an instrumental role in terms of economic growth. So building the capacity to ensure that you have the requisite skills in the industry is also very key to ensure that they play a meaningful role. And then government could also play a very critical role in terms of the ecosystem, favorable tax regimes and shared investments with the industry, and then spin-off of space technology into non-space sectors. There's a huge opportunity to take what's developed in the space sector into the non-space sector, and vice versa actually, spin spin-offs and spin-ins as well. And then where there's no industrial base with regards to emerging nations, we might leverage of multinationals. And where governments set up the project, invite multinationals. But we have to be very careful that it's not multinationals leading the projects, but multinational assisting building capabilities and capacities within those countries. Okay? So the model that you adopt in terms of bringing new players or players from outside the country inside is very important. And what's important as well that for technology transfer, if you want to ensure that there's technology transfer from outside to inside the emerging nation, you have to have the experience or the skills. You have to ensure there's a level of independence in terms of how you operate. And secondly, there's a sustainability aspect, that you're not sort of hinging off that funding would come from outside, but you're actually fully sustained. And then you also need to ensure that when you build the capacity or the skills, that skills actually have a multiplying factor in terms of leveraging a number of the benefits back into the country. And then you also create the conducive environment for investments. If you have all of these ingredients sort of set up, then the investors will come through and support what you're trying to do. Now, I think this was, although it's a sixth plenary, I thought it was a very important aspect of the discussion, because very often you see new space nations sort of, or countries expressing an interest of setting up a space agency. But what my experience is that they haven't actually dabbled with what it is that goes into your space policy and strategy. And I think the discussion kind of focused on where's this departure point for the policy, legal policy discussion. So dual-use technology is a key aspect, because a lot of what goes into the space technology is also dual-use technology. There's also the UN treaties and conventions, which needs to be embedded in terms of national space program from a legislative perspective. And then also, if you're setting up national laws, how does that resonate with the UN treaties and conventions? And then space law and policy needs to be taught at universities. It's not something you import into the country when you need it and then forget about it. It actually needs to be embedded inside of the national space program. And so it needs to become a core curriculum of the universities. And there's also a need for common understanding across states. So if you, let's say, a country somewhere in the middle of Africa, you need to ensure that what you're trying to do from a space perspective is also aligned to what your neighbors are trying to do as well. Okay? Because if you're looking at collaboration across borders, your space policy law aspect needs to be aligned. And I think from, just to give you a South African perspective, our very first agreement we signed was with Russia. And a large part of the negotiation was around the fact that South Africa was still signing up to the UN treaties and conventions, whereas Russia had already done so. So what does it mean for collaboration in terms of liability convention if something went wrong? So it was a huge, I think it lasted about 3 or 4 days, just negotiating around those aspects. So it could come back, especially when you're working with your regional partners. Now, I think if you look around, it's sort of a time for change in terms of the treaties and conventions, all the regulations. You have new actors, you have new activities, manufacturing in space. What does it mean? There's no sovereignty associated with manufacturing in space. What does that mean? Concerns arising. If you land on the moon, what does it mean in terms of sovereign rights? Tensions that can arise in terms of mining of resources. So these are new challenges that I think we're facing, we're still grappling with. And I think over time we'll have to find the legislative space of how we accommodate all of these issues. And then the last point was around space sustainability, the long-term sustainability of outer space, debris mitigation, and space traffic management. So those are the topical issues that also needs to be brought into the fold when you're discussing setting up a space program. So that was the 6th plenary session. And there was, as I mentioned, a Space Generation Advisory Council meeting in the 2nd day. And they suggested a number of working groups being established. The one is on regional collaboration and space applications. The other one using the Internet of Things and space applications. The third was legal and policy challenges of space applications. The fourth was technology development for socio-economic development, and then engaging the next generation from emerging countries. So that's in essence the full scope of what was discussed, the 6 plenaries and the SGAC. So that's the presentation in terms of what transpired at GLEC 2019. And then I just want to share the video with you, which is about 2 minutes, in terms of you getting an appreciation of what actually took place. Okay, can we have some volume? I think the volume is down. So I'm just going to ask Kirsten and Crystal just to give their perspective of the experience of GLEC 2019.
Sure, no problem. First of all, we're a little disappointed some of our fellow moderators couldn't be here, so if anyone has other follow-up questions afterwards. One of the things that impressed me the most at the event was the similar messages we heard from a variety of panels. As you saw from Val's summary, the panels had a really wide-ranging set of topics, and yet all of the different perspectives from around Africa, from around the globe, kind of converge on certain themes, as you saw. And so even though I handled base infrastructure, there was a lot of repetition in a good way from the panel on capacity building or the panel on applications. I thought there was a lot of synergy in the sense of what a developing space nation should be focused on and what is happening. Even from more developed nations, there was a lot of this is not the way, the path that we have followed in the past is not the path to follow now, and particularly from a benefit perspective. So I thought there were a lot of really good ideas generated.
I'll follow on to that. As Val mentioned, it was a wide range of participation, and with that came a wide range of perspectives, and also a recognition that there's no one-size-fits-all, that as emerging countries are considering what their goals and objectives are in space, they need to be true to what their goals are as a country and for their space program. So those messages came through really strongly.
I just want to mention, this is the first time ever in the history of the IAF that we had a global conference on emerging countries, on space for emerging countries. Now, if you take that into perspective, I made this point earlier today. If you take US, China, India, and the whole of Europe, they still don't make up the surface area of Africa. And then if you look around the conference, you'll see the problem in terms of representation. And I haven't even mentioned Latin America, parts of Middle East and Asia, in terms of what I call the silent voice, not being represented. Okay. So for us, I think it was a huge milestone in terms of getting this on the events calendar of the IAF. But it's also, I think, important to keep the momentum going in terms of keeping the conversation alive, because we don't want it to be just a once-off event and then forgotten. So I think from emerging countries, there's a perspective, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. But maybe if I can pose it from a developing nations perspective, how do you see yourself lending the support to emerging nations?
Well, so I work for Secure World Foundation, and one of the things that we believe is that so our mission is focused on space sustainability, maintaining a peaceful, safe, secure, and usable space environment, which we think benefits all nations. And we really believe strongly in that need for international collaboration, that any potential solution and development in space isn't going to be led by the same actors that have been dominant for a period of time, although they still play an incredibly important role, but that we really do have to look for a variety of forum, not only to have discussions about what to and how to develop, but also how to make sure that that development is managed in a way that we all continue to benefit from the long term. And one of the things that I find really heartening is when we do have these larger conversations, I actually think that question is first and foremost. I think there's a strong understanding that we need to balance the need for rapid expansion among a variety of new actors with responsible behavior. And it was really exciting to see those topics to the extent we could talk about them at this conference, and to realize that even here at IAC, that is something we are all interested in.
From my standpoint, I live in Morocco, and so for me, being able to get the space generation, that cohort of young professionals involved and engaged, I was able to assist in having a number of young professionals attend the GLEC conference, and for them it was a first-time professional conference experience, and so I think all of those things, the more opportunities there are for young professionals in emerging countries to participate as well, not just people who've been in the industry for some time. Those things are really key for the sustainment and for the interest in having another GLEC conference.
And I think just from my perspective, if you look at it from an emerging nations perspective, let's take Africa as an example. The majority of the population are under 35. Okay, and when you don't have opportunities, you perpetuate the situation. By the way, there was a study done in South Africa from a social sciences perspective. If you are born to a family that's poor, let's put it that way, there's a 70% chance that when you grow up as an adult, you will also be poor. But if you're born into a family that's, let's say, wealthy, there's a 50% chance that you will be wealthy. So the disparity actually grows because you're actually churning off even from the wealthy end into the poor end. So that's an emerging nation. So it's poverty sort of breeding poverty. And you need to find a mechanism to break that chain. And the only way you can do it is to stimulate the youth in terms of engaging in opportunities like this. Otherwise, when you don't create those opportunities, it's social ills, crime, drugs, sexual abuse. And that's the reality that we're dealing with in emerging nations, developing countries. But it's very important for us to stimulate the youth from a science, technology, engineering, mathematics perspective.
Well, we also saw during the conference that when we talk about development in space and developing space nations, we often forget to look at what is available and what is there and how do you build off of that. There was a great discussion about the prevalence of GIS skills, which are obviously highly related to the geospatial and remote sensing industry, which are quite available, in Africa, for example, and in other places. And how do we build on what's there to create industries that might not model like a typical development in another place, but that work and provide opportunities in the right context?
Maybe very quickly we can take 2 or 3 questions from the floor. Is there anybody that has a question? Because I think the next session is about to start. Does anybody have a question? None? Okay. There's one. Yeah.
What was the response of the IAF to the GLEC?
In terms of continuity?
Well, no, in terms of what you've discovered, how did they take it on?
Well,
the information that was decided then and the issues and...
Okay, so we do have a working group tomorrow. It's the working group on developing countries and emerging nations, where we'll be tabling the report and then seeing how we make sense of the report and what's the next steps around that. So I think it's a day earlier in terms of asking the question. So maybe if you ask me on Thursday, I would probably have an answer for you. But it's work in progress, yes. Thank you. Okay, I think we run out of time. So I'd like to thank my panelists and also you for your attention. Thank you so much. Thank you.